Welcome to the Human Flourishing Project. I'm Alex Epstein. Today's topic is mindsets for overcoming adverse circumstances. And specifically, I want to focus on two of them, which I'm going to call customer obsession and 100% responsibility. But before I get into those, let me just tell you a little bit about why I'm covering this. Two recent experiences are motivating me. One is that in the last day or two, I've watched a couple of fascinating documentary type things involving the economist Walter Williams. So Walter Williams was a very pro-liberty economist. He was born under adverse circumstances himself. He was Black, born in the projects in Philadelphia, I think in the 40s or so, maybe the 30s, and definitely, particularly a little later in life when he went south, when he was drafted for war, he had a lot of racial discrimination against him in Georgia. And he's just a totally impressive guy. I didn't know a lot of the stories about him, but I've been a fan of his for a long time. In fact, when I graduated college, I wrote several writers that I admired and asked for advice, and he was one of the 6 or so that I wrote, and he responded. He gave me a very nice response. I don't know if he had too much advice, but he definitely encouraged me and said something like, "Your articles are excellent," and it was very cool to hear from Walter Williams. So he was he was known to many, I think, because he was a guest host of the Rush Limbaugh show. But the main thing, he was an economics professor at George Mason University for decades, and was reputed to be a very, very good teacher, which I would totally expect, just given what I've heard of his commentary, his radio commentary, and then his interviews, and then reading his writing. He had a popular syndicated column for decades as well. But the thing that motivated me in particular about Williams is this combination of his own adverse circumstances and then his own focus on what are the societal conditions necessary for people to overcome adverse circumstances. And one other perspective is what things do we need to avoid to create unnecessarily adverse circumstances. And his perspective is very similar to mine, in that he regards government welfare or wealth transfer programs as actually creating very adverse circumstances, particularly for the poorest people. So the two resources are, if you search Walter Williams Free to Choose on YouTube, let me just confirm that this is true. If you are on thoughtful.community, not that you can get there quite yet, but I would sign up. And Thoughtful, I'm about to share it on Thoughtful. So if you're there, you'll be able to see it on Thoughtful very soon. But if Walter Williams Free to Choose, and the two are, so one is called Walter Williams Suffer No Fools, and the other, which is a couple items down, is Good Intentions with Walter E. Williams. And I don't know, they're both excellent, and it's an hour and a half total, but I just love his own story and the things that he fought against, which I did not know about. And I love his advocacy of freedom as crucial, and his identification of many things as adversarial that aren't, including the minimum wage, which works against young, unskilled people and prevents them from getting the job experience that can allow them to become more skilled. And he talks about different kinds of licensing that particularly discriminates against young, poor people, including young, poor Black people who are in low opportunity situations. He talks about the government-controlled education system. So fascinating thing, but it really made me think, God, I wish, it's so sad for even another reason that he died in December. And just, this is a voice, like his voice, his advocacy of, freedom, individual responsibility, overcoming obstacles. And I think he just had a really amazing mindset. There's just not enough of that in today's world. So not that I'm Walter Williams, but it just makes me motivated to think, okay, is there anything I can say about overcoming adverse circumstances? And then the other thing is, I was discussing a week or two ago with my girlfriend Cassandra, a related issue, she's somebody who grew up in very difficult circumstances, which I won't go into, but like, it's very impressive what she was able to do to pull herself out of that and putting herself through different schools in different kinds of ways. And she's unusually smart and then just certain really good qualities. So she doesn't need my ideas on this, but we're just talking about how so many people that she grew up with in urban Milwaukee, they almost never hear any kind of good advice. And there's this question of, like, if you're in really difficult circumstances, particularly like job circumstances, you don't have many skills, what can you do to get ahead? And it made me think that a lot of the advice that I've gotten, and maybe that I've given, is often oriented toward people at a certain success level. And in my case, both giving and receiving, it tends to be entrepreneurial in nature for people who are doing their own independent thing, often having their own independent business, because that is my own situation. But it made me think, it'd be really valuable to identify what are, like, if you're really starting out in a difficult state of things, what are the most important things? Or is there anything I can think of that's useful? Occasionally this will come up in some form, because like Uber drivers and stuff will be asking me questions if they have some sense of, might just be they see I'm very focused when I work, so that might strike them, or they'll see, oh, you live in a nice neighborhood, and some of them are asking about that. But even they're in considerably better circumstances than most people. But I've thought about just, okay, what are the most general things? Because certain things, like if I talk about inevitably productive processes, yeah, that's something that in a sense is universally valuable. But for somebody who's just getting their first cashier job, that's not going to be obvious to them how valuable it is. So I've thought a bunch about what are the basic things that anyone can use to help themselves overcome adverse circumstances. And with that in mind, I'll talk about the two mindsets that I think are universal and can be very valuable for anyone, but particularly those who are in adverse circumstances. So the first mindset I want to talk about is customer obsession. Now, this might seem like, oh, this is advice for entrepreneurs, because, well, customers, don't you have to have a business to have a customer? And no. And I think this is part of actually why I'm putting it deliberately as customer obsession, is that so I'm speaking specifically to people who are just starting out in work, it's extremely valuable to think of your boss as one key customer. If you're interfacing with the business's customers, you also want to be thinking about them as customers. So customer obsession, that's a term I got from Amazon's Jeff Bezos, that I think is their number one value, or at least the first of 14 values or principles they list as a company. It's the one he talks about most historically. And the obsession really captures how Amazon's oriented there, and it's not an exaggeration for them. They're just amazing in terms of their orientation toward customers. And I think this is a really good thing to think about no matter what job circumstance you're in, particularly if you're at the beginning. So if you think about, okay, who are my customers? So it's probably my boss, and then any customers that I interface with, really anyone that I interface with. And you start to think, what does it mean to be obsessed with them? Well, it means to be obsessed with their goals and their outcomes. And I would say being obsessed means you're really thinking about helping them achieve whatever the highest goals, or having them, maybe it's better to put it as like them having the best possible outcome. So occasionally I'll just be dealing with somebody in a normal, like, quote, normal job, or and kind of seemingly unremarkable job, where I was just having the experience the other night where we were ordering from a local restaurant. I guess I can mention it. It's called the Wine Gallery in Laguna Beach, and so they have they have some good food that we were ordering, and whoever was doing customer service that night was just super good. I was just very impressed because she had the right tone of enthusiasm. She was sharp. She picked up on my order. She was very accommodating. We had a bunch of specific requests for her. And I just thought, man, maybe I could use this person some way. And I didn't have a specific use, and I didn't have that much to go on. But what that captures is that when somebody does their job exceptionally, and when they're really oriented toward you in an exceptional way, that creates opportunity for the person. That gets noticed. To use a Cal Newport term, you start to become so good they can't ignore you. So you just think about a regular job. There's this question, okay, I got this job. Is it a dead-end job? It might not be the greatest job. But if you can be sufficiently customer obsessed in your job, I think it's almost inevitable that you are going to stand out either to your boss, to your coworkers, or to customers who interact with you, because there are not that many people who are customer obsessed. So I think one way, if we just talk about how to deal with your boss, one way to think about it is you want to get clear on your boss's ideal outcome. And I'm sure there are different strategies and tactics for doing that. But if you just think about it, I want to know for my boss, what is a dream come true? So you might talk to the boss and say, hey, what the best person who's ever done this job, like, what did they do? You might ask even first, who was that? And then what did they do that was so great? And then you might also ask, what would your dream employee do? But you just want to get a sense of what is your boss's ideal outcome. Like if they could have a fantasy, a dream come true, what would it be like? And then if you're aware of that, then you could probably help a bunch of that dream come true, and you will stand out because so few people have the kind of dedication to really understand somebody's needs and what total satisfaction would look like, and then to go after that. And then if you think the same for your coworkers, like, hey, how could I be a really good coworker? What would that be like? And with the customers you deal with, that's great, because if they see you, successful people are always looking for good people to work with. So if I just think about, if you work at I'm just trying to think of a standard, really get a massage place, and there are going to be a bunch of people who are paying whatever, $100 for massages. Like if you're just amazing in the way you deal with them, at some point someone's going to try to hire you away if you want to be hired away, or your boss will know, or you'll get all sorts of compliments. So this customer obsession thing is, the reason I'm stressing it is because it's such a universal thing that you can benefit from at any stage. So then let me jump to the next mindset, which is 100% responsibility. And I'd originally planned to do this first, but I think it's better to do customer obsession first, because that gives you more content in terms of something you can do in any situation. And then the responsibility is a mindset for everything. And I would take 100% responsibility means that my situation is 100% my responsibility to improve for the better. So my situation is 100% my responsibility to improve for the better. And I'm going to break this down into a couple of aspects, it's particularly when you're in adverse circumstances, it is such a landmine to not have this. And it's so understandable, because there are all sorts of injustices. There are all sorts of things you can point to that aren't fair. There are things others got that you didn't get. And I think so much of what's going wrong in our society today is people are taught to focus on that. And I'm going to talk about a different way to address injustices, because it's legitimate to be concerned about, but not as a primary focus. And so I'll break it down. So one aspect of being 100% responsible is that my circumstances aren't necessarily my fault, but they are 100% my responsibility. One of the things that trips people up is they can point to, hey, you know what? This happened to me. This happened to my parents. And it's not my fault. It doesn't happen, and it's not fair. And that can be totally true. And you can have a certain amount of compassion for yourself, and others can have compassion for you. But nevertheless, that is where you are. It is your responsibility. Now, if someone else is already helping you, that's great. If there's some way you can really get somebody to help you in a way that you're comfortable with, that's great. That's part of taking responsibility. But when responsibility really has this binary quality to it, where you decide, okay, either I'm going to do whatever is necessary, including enlisting other people to make my circumstances better, or I'm going to bitch about it. Like, and you can't be in both modes at the same time, I don't think. And so the kind of unfairness mode, that needs to be separate. It's not that it's illegitimate, but it needs to be dealt with separately. And so one way to deal with it is to separate fault from responsibility. So it doesn't mean you're blaming yourself for everything that's difficult. Not at all. It's just, it doesn't matter in a very real sense. You're just saying, okay, this is where I am. I am going to take responsibility. One perspective I find particularly helpful is just to think about people throughout history and just think about, okay, wherever we are, whatever situation we're in, almost everyone in history had it much, much worse than we did. And then impoverished people around the world have it much, much worse than any impoverished person in the US. So there's always that perspective, but whatever you need to take 100% responsibility. Second point, taking responsibility cannot involve simultaneously fighting for fairness. So the way I think of fighting for fairness, and that is a legitimate thing, and I do it as part of my profession, but you have to be clear if it's part of your profession. It's that you think of that as a recreational activity. So let's just make it concrete. So let's take let's say, concerns in places where they are legitimate about like corruption in police departments. So let's say you're an individual. It doesn't really matter what skin color you are, because I think everyone can be legitimately concerned with that. And so you could say, okay, yes, I want to do this. And so like, I'm going to take part of my time, like if this cause really matters to me over and above all other causes, like I'm going to take some time to do this. And I would say, I discussed in a previous episode, like you need to really learn about it to actually figure out what's going to be constructive, because often the thing everyone is latching onto is destructive. But I stress it's a recreational thing. If you're an individual, particularly in a bad circumstance, your overwhelming focus needs to be, how do I improve my circumstance? And that it can't be blended with like, oh yeah, and I'm also going to fix the whole world at the same time. And this often happens within a job. And maybe that's even the better example, where you think like, oh yeah, my boss is not being fair to me. I've certainly felt that before. And you can think of that in kind of a long-term strategic sense. Hey, is there anything I can do? Let me think about this. But you have to just really be clear on what is my job, like to do a great job, to be customer obsessed, including boss obsessed. What do I need to do a great job? And if they're unfair things, like if they're so unfair that I can't succeed, then and I have a better option, then go pursue the better option. But as long as it's my best option, take 100% responsibility for doing the best thing right now, and then think of it as a side project to address unfairness. And Walter Williams, in this story, he seemed to be a good model of this, because he did these amazing things in terms of like writing the U.S. military about the injustices there, and but he did not let that get in the way of him being, doing what he needed to do to be a leading economist. I had a small example of this myself when I was a freshman at Duke, when I think I got treated really unjustly, and there was a threat of kicking me out of the school, and I could have easily just become a poster child for certain types of campus oppression in terms of, suppressing the exchange of ideas and stuff like that. And I decided like, okay, at most this is going to be a side thing. This is not going to define me. I have things I want to do. That's my focus. I'll do these things on the side if I can. And it didn't for me, it didn't make sense. I just decided, okay, that's not my battle right now. I'm just going to leave this particular program that I was in I found important in many ways anyway. And I just focused on what I needed to focus on to take responsibility for changing my circumstances. The final aspect of 100% responsibility that I want to highlight is, I'm currently calling it, maybe I'll have a better name later, but suffer, not complain. Or maybe it's okay to suffer, but not to complain. So when you're dealing with adverse circumstances, it can be in work, outside of work, there is real suffering. And I don't want to pretend that I can relate to the suffering that many people are going through right now and have gone through. I've had a lot of different kinds of suffering in my life, and I can talk about that, but people have had way worse. I'm not going to win any kind of suffering Olympics, nor am I going to try to. But whatever the situation is, like complaining is different than acknowledging suffering. So to say, so I remember, one of my heroes, Ayn Rand, she, who came from Russia, communist Russia, could have easily gotten killed there and knew basically no English, and then became one of the leading English writers, English language writers in the world, selling ultimately, I think her books have sold tens of millions of copies. She was early on, I think during the Depression, different circumstances. I mean, she would cry because she felt like I could write and I need to work all day and like wardrobe and sewing and stuff. And so that it's totally understandable to suffer. But that is very different from complaining. Because the thing with complaining is basically saying the world should be different and other people should change it for me. And so I'm going to bitch about the world. And that somehow is part of dealing with my circumstance. Whereas I would separate them. I would just say, yes, I can suffer. I'll give myself a little time to suffer. If I need to, I'll deal with it later. I can talk to my friends about, this is hard for me, but I'm not going to complain, because complain, again, implies that the world is mistreating me and it's somebody else's responsibility to change it. But if you're not taking action, nobody's changing it. So I find that complaining is almost universally toxic, whereas suffering and acknowledging suffering can be part of a healthy process. So I hope that those are helpful. I'm not 100% sure that they are. I'm really eager for feedback. So as always, you can contact me with questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail at alex@alexepstein.com. And just as a recap, these just two mindsets that I find particularly helpful for overcoming adverse circumstances are customer obsession in the broadest sense, including everybody you work with, including your boss, and also 100% responsibility. All right, that is it for this week. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Let's see, what else? If you want to discuss this on Facebook, I should say, go to facebook.com/Human Flourishing Project. All right, I'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been the Human Flourishing Project.